Gravedigger sees something strange in Old Grave. Dog starts howling before opening. Mark Peterson had never witnessed his faithful companion Duke act so strangely during his 20 years of work at the Pinewood Municipal Cemetery. The German shepherd, always calm and obedient, began to howl desperately in front of a century-old grave that was to be exhumed by court order on that cold June morning. The court order had arrived the previous week, demanding the exhumation of the grave of Helen Oakwood Smith, whose remains needed to be transferred to make way for a new section of the cemetery. But when Mark approached the old black marble grave, Duke began to show signs of agitation he had never displayed before. The gravedigger stopped his work for a moment, observing the animal's unusual behavior. Duke walked in circles around the grave, sniffing intensely at the base of the headstone and emitting low, prolonged whimpers that made the hairs on Mark's arms stand on end. The dog had worked alongside him on hundreds of exhumations, always serene and cooperative, even helping to locate old graves when necessary. "Easy, boy. What's going on with you today?" murmured Mark, trying to calm the animal while picking up his tools. But Duke wouldn't calm down. On the contrary, his howls became more intense with every move Mark made toward the grave. The sound echoed among the cypress trees and the other headstones, creating an unsettling atmosphere on that foggy morning in rural Pennsylvania. Mark had started working at the cemetery at 15 as an assistant to the old gravedigger Old Ben. Now at 35, he knew every inch of that place like the back of his hand. He was born and raised in Pinewood Hills, a small town nestled in the mountains, where everyone knew each other and secrets seemed impossible to keep for long. The grave of Helen Oakwood Smith had always caught his attention. Unlike the other graves in the cemetery, this one had a more elaborate construction, with imported marble and bronze details that already showed signs of the passage of time. But what intrigued Mark the most was the fact that, in all these years, he had never seen anyone visit it or leave flowers, except for one person. Mrs. Hope Morrison, a highly respected widow in town, visited that grave religiously every first Friday of the month. Mark always watched her from a distance, noticing how she remained there for long minutes, sometimes whispering words that the wind carried away before he could understand them. When he once asked her out of curiosity, she had simply replied that she was visiting her late husband's grave. But Mark knew that Mrs. Hope's husband, Anthony Morrison, was buried in the new section of the cemetery, in a perpetual vault she herself had commissioned 15 years ago. So why did she visit a completely different grave, belonging to someone with a different last name? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It's a huge help for us who are just starting out. Now continuing, temporarily ignoring Duke's persistent howls, Mark began working on removing the heavy marble headstone. The process was always delicate, especially with old graves like that one, where time and moisture could have compromised the structure. Using the proper tools and a lot of care, he managed to lift the lid after almost an hour of hard work. What he found inside, however, made his heart race. Besides the expected remains, there was an intact metal box, protected from moisture by a waxed leather wrapping. The box, which seemed to have been placed there on purpose, was positioned so it didn't touch the remains, as if someone had added it to the original grave later. With trembling hands, Mark carefully removed the box from the tomb. Duke, who had stopped howling the moment the headstone was moved, now watched the gravedigger's every move intently, as if he knew the importance of that moment. The box wasn't locked. Inside, Mark found a collection of documents carefully preserved on parchment paper, some certificates that looked very old, and a black-and-white photograph that left him completely perplexed. The image showed a girl of about 8 years old, dressed in clothes that seemed to be from the 1940s. But what really shocked Mark was the child's face in the photograph. It was identical to that of Claire, Mrs. Hope Morrison's 20-something-year-old granddaughter. The same expressive eyes, the same face shape, even the same dimple in the chin that he had noticed on Claire the few times he had met her in town. The resemblance was so striking that, for a moment, Mark even thought it could be an old photo of Claire herself. But the clothes and the style of the photograph made it clear it had been taken decades before the young woman was born. Feeling he had discovered something much bigger than a simple routine exhumation, Mark carefully stored the box and its contents in his tool bag. Something in his instinct told him that those documents and that photograph should not be handed over to the authorities immediately, at least not until he understood better what they meant. He completed the exhumation work as determined by the court order, but his mind remained focused on the mysterious discovery. The whole way back home, Duke walked silently by his side, as if he also knew that something important had happened that morning. Mark lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, an inheritance from his parents who had passed when he was still young. He was a reserved man by nature, who preferred the company of books and Duke to the social bustle of the town. But that discovery left him too restless to maintain his usual isolation. That night, under the yellow light of his dining table, he examined the documents found in the box more closely. There were birth certificates, parish records, and even some handwritten letters in a delicate feminine script. One of the certificates especially caught his attention. It was a birth certificate dated 1943, recording the birth of a child named Mary Helen, born to an unmarried mother. What intrigued him was that the mother's name had been carefully crossed out with ink, making it illegible. Only a few letters remained visible, but not enough to identify who the woman was. In the section for the father, it only said, "Not declared," something common at the time for children born out of wedlock. But there was more. Among the papers, he found what appeared to be a baptism record for the same child, performed at St. Anthony's Church, the town's main church. The document, signed by the priest at the time, contained additional information not present on the birth certificate. According to the record, the child had been baptized just 3 months after birth, a period considered long for the standards of the time. In the margin of the baptism document, there was a handwritten note in faded ink. Placed in the care of the adoptive family on September 15, 1943. May God bless this child and her new family. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. He was facing documents that revealed an adoption that had occurred more than 80 years ago. But why were these papers buried with Helen Oakwood Smith? And what was the connection to the photograph of the child who was identical to Claire? He spent the entire night analyzing every detail of the documents, taking notes and trying to establish connections. Duke slept at his feet, occasionally lifting his head as if he sensed his owner's anxiety. When the sun rose, Mark had made a decision. He needed to find out more about Helen Oakwood Smith and her possible connection to Mrs. Hope's family. And he knew exactly where to begin his investigation, the Municipal Hall archives, where the town's oldest records were kept. The next morning, he went to the Municipal Hall building with a plausible excuse. He told the clerk in charge of the archives that he was researching the history of the town's old families for a personal project. It wasn't a complete lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The clerk, Mrs. Caroline, who had worked there for more than 30 years, received him warmly. She had known Mark since he was a boy and knew of his reputation as a serious and trustworthy person. "It's so good to see you interested in our town's history, Mark. It's been a long time since anyone came to research these old things. What do you want to know specifically?" "I'm trying to better understand some families who lived here in the 1940s and 1950s, mainly about a certain Helen Oakwood Smith. Do you happen to know that name?" Mrs. Caroline thought for a few moments, consulting her memories and some records she kept organized. Helen Oakwood Smith. That name sounds familiar, but I can't remember exactly from where. Let's take a look in the old archives. We might find something. They spent the entire morning searching through dusty records, civil registry books, and old municipal documents. It was then that Mrs. Caroline found a reference that made Mark's eyes light up. Here it is. Helen Oakwood Smith appears in a record from 1944 as a registered midwife in the municipality. She provided services for families in the region and apparently had a very good reputation. Look, there are even some notes about births she attended. Mark felt he was on the right track. A midwife would certainly have had access to information about births, adoptions, and the family secrets of the time. That could explain the presence of the adoption documents in her grave. Is there any more information about her? When she died, if she had family, those kinds of things? Let me look. Here is the death record. Helen Oakwood Smith passed away in 1946, at 42 years of age. Cause of death recorded as respiratory complications. Interesting. In the field for next of kin, it says no known descendants. Mark wrote down all the information, but he knew he was still far from solving the mystery. A midwife who died in 1946 couldn't be the person in the photograph who was identical to Claire, but there was certainly a connection he still couldn't see. He thanked Mrs. Caroline for her help and returned home more intrigued than before. During lunch, while Duke watched attentively, Mark organized his findings into a timeline. 1943, birth of Mary Helen, daughter of an unmarried mother. 1943, adoption of the child 3 months later. 1944, Helen Oakwood Smith registered as a municipal midwife. 1946, passing of Helen Oakwood Smith. 1946, present, grave visited monthly by Mrs. Hope. There was clearly a gap in information between 1946 and the present day. Mark needed to find out what had happened to the adopted child and how it connected to Mrs. Hope's family. It was at that moment he decided to do something that might be considered rude, but which his curiosity made necessary. He resolved to discreetly observe Mrs. Hope's next monthly visit to the grave, which was due to happen the following Friday. On Friday morning, Mark arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual and positioned himself strategically among some trees where he could observe the grave he had exhumed without being noticed. Duke stayed home this time to avoid drawing attention. Promptly at 9 in the morning, Mrs. Hope arrived at the cemetery. Mark watched with extra care every gesture of the woman in her early 70s. She walked directly to where the grave of Helen Oakwood Smith had been, but stopped abruptly upon noticing the headstone was no longer there. The expression on Mrs. Hope's face changed dramatically. From serene and contemplative, it first became confused, then clearly anguished. She looked around as if searching for explanations, her hands trembling slightly as she held a small bouquet of white daisies. Mark saw when she quickly went to the cemetery's small office, where she spoke with the administrator. He couldn't hear the conversation, but from their gestures he could tell Mrs. Hope was visibly upset about the discovery of the exhumation. After a few minutes, she left the office with hurried steps, leaving the flowers on a nearby bench. Mark had never seen her so agitated. Normally she was the picture of composure and elegance, but at that moment she seemed like a woman haunted by ghosts of the past. The situation left him in a moral dilemma. On one hand, he felt he had the right to know the truth about his discovery. On the other, he didn't want to cause unnecessary suffering to a respectable lady of the community, but his conscience weighed heavily, especially considering the contents of the documents he had found. He decided he needed to act with delicacy, but he needed to act. That afternoon, he went to Mrs. Hope's house, an old and elegant building in the town's historic center. The house reflected the social status of the Morrison family, with well-kept gardens and architecture reminiscent of the golden age of the coffee region. He rang the doorbell with some hesitation. When Mrs. Hope answered the door, Mark immediately noticed she had been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she seemed to have aged years in just a few hours. "Mark, what are you doing here, my boy?" "Mrs. Hope, sorry to bother you. I need to talk to you about something important. It's about the grave that was exhumed yesterday." Her reaction was immediate and intense. Her face paled and she leaned against the doorframe as if her legs were about to give way. You know something?" "May I come in? I think it's better if we talk in private." Mrs. Hope hesitated for a moment, but then opened the door and invited him in. The living room was decorated with antique furniture and family photographs that told decades of history. Mark immediately noticed several pictures of Claire at different ages, once again confirming the striking resemblance to the child in the photograph he had found. "Mrs. Hope, during the exhumation I found some documents that were buried with the remains. I think you need to see this." He carefully took the photograph from his briefcase and placed it on the coffee table. Mrs. Hope's reaction was devastating. She let out a muffled scream and brought her hands to her chest, as if having difficulty breathing. My God in heaven! How did this end up there? Do you know the child in the photo?" Mrs. Hope didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to one of the shelves and took out an old photo album. With trembling hands, she flipped through a few pages until she found what she was looking for. "Look at this, Mark." It was an almost identical photograph, but showing a young woman of about 20 years. The resemblance to the child in the photograph found on the grave was undeniable. It was clearly the same person, just a few years older. "This is my daughter, Caroline. This photo was taken when she was 20, in 1963. Mark felt as if the ground had moved under his feet. The woman in the photograph that Mrs. Hope was showing him was unmistakably Claire's mother. He knew her well, as Caroline still lived in town and was one of the teachers at the municipal school. "Mrs. Hope, I don't understand. How can there be a photograph of your daughter as a child buried in a grave from 1946, when she was born much later?" It was then that Mrs. Hope completely broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she let herself fall into an armchair, as if the weight of decades of secrets was finally crushing her. "Because Caroline is not my biological daughter, Mark. She is adopted." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and Mrs. Hope's muffled sobs. Mark remained silent, respecting the woman's obvious pain and waiting for her to find the strength to continue. "I never told this to anyone. Not to Caroline, not to my late husband, Anthony. He died believing Caroline was our biological daughter. How did this happen?" Mrs. Hope wiped her eyes with a delicate handkerchief and took a deep breath before continuing. "In 1943, I was very young. I was only 16 when I married Anthony. In the first years of our marriage, we tried to have children, but I always lost the babies in the first few months. The doctors at the time said I had some problem, that I might never be able to have children." She paused, as if reliving painful memories. Anthony was devastated. Back then, having children was fundamental to a marriage. He never openly blamed me, but I knew he suffered as much as I did. And I felt like a failure as a woman. Mark was beginning to understand the scale of the drama unfolding before him. That's when I met Helen Oakwood Smith. She was the most respected midwife in the region and also helped families going through difficulties. Helen knew about my situation, and one day she came to me with a proposal. "What kind of proposal?" She said she knew a young lady from the city who had gotten pregnant out of wedlock, and that the family was desperate to resolve the situation discreetly. The young woman couldn't keep the child for social reasons, and Helen thought it would be a perfect solution for both parties. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Mrs. Hope continued her confession with a voice full of emotion. "Helen arranged everything very carefully. When the child was born, in September 1943, she came to me. It was a beautiful, healthy and perfect baby girl. Helen said the biological mother wanted to know nothing more about the child and wished for her to be raised by a good, stable family." "And your husband? How did he react when you showed up with a baby?" "That was the biggest mistake of my life, Mark. I lied to him. I faked a pregnancy during the last few months, wearing loose clothes and claiming I preferred to have my prenatal care with Helen instead of going to the doctors in the capital." Anthony was so happy at the prospect of being a father that he accepted all my explanations without question. The confession was getting heavier with every word. Mark could see Mrs. Hope's genuine suffering and began to understand why she visited Helen's grave every month. "Helen helped me simulate the birth. We stayed isolated at home for a few days, and when Anthony came home from work, I was in bed with the baby in my arms. He was overjoyed. He never suspected a thing. But why were the documents buried with Helen? Helen was a very wise woman, concerned about the future. She said she would keep all the original adoption papers in a safe place in case they were ever needed. When she became seriously ill in 1946, she called me for a final conversation." Mrs. Hope made another pause, wiping her eyes again. "Helen said she had hidden all the documents in a place where they would be protected until the right time for the truth to come out. She believed that family secrets shouldn't be buried forever, but she also knew that sometimes you had to wait for the proper moment." "And she never said where she had hidden the papers?" "No. She only said that when the time came, they would appear naturally." At the time I thought it was feverish rambling, but now I see she knew exactly what she was doing. Mark was impressed by the complexity of the situation. Helen had literally buried the secrets along with her, ensuring they remained protected for decades until the right moment for their discovery arrived. Mrs. Hope, there's one more thing I need to ask. Do you know who Carmen's biological mother was? The question made Mrs. Hope hesitate again. Her eyes shifted, as if she were deciding how much of the truth she could share. Helen never told me the full name. She only mentioned that she was from a very important family in town, but for social reasons couldn't acknowledge the pregnancy publicly. It was a common situation back then, unfortunately. But do you have any suspicions? I was always curious, but Helen was very discreet about that subject. She said it was better for everyone involved if those details remained secret. Mark realized Mrs. Hope wasn't being completely honest about that specific point, but decided not to press her right then. The woman had already revealed secrets kept for 80 years, and forcing her to reveal more could be counterproductive. Mrs. Hope, what do you intend to do now? Does Carmen know anything about this? Nothing. Carmen always believed she is our biological daughter. She even inherited some traits that happened to resemble Anthony's, so there were never any questions. And Claire, my granddaughter, never suspected a thing. The mention of Claire reminded Mark of another intriguing aspect of the situation. Mrs. Hope, have you noticed how much Claire looks like the child in the photograph? Of course I've noticed. All these years I've always been struck by how much Claire looked like Carmen as a child. But now, seeing this photograph, it's like the same person at different times. That's not just a coincidence. It's a very strong genetic resemblance, suggesting a direct family lineage. Mrs. Hope looked at Mark with an expression of sudden understanding. Are you suggesting that Carmen's biological mother is still alive? It's possible, and if she is, Claire would be her great-granddaughter. That would explain the striking resemblance. The possibility made Mrs. Hope stand up abruptly and walk to the window, as if she needed fresh air to process this information. Mark, I need you to promise me one thing. Don't tell any of this to Carmen or Claire until I decide how to handle this situation. These are 80 years of lies that could destroy our family. I promise, Mrs. Hope. But you need to know that other people might also have access to this information. The exhumation was official, and if someone decides to investigate more deeply, I know that's why I need to resolve this quickly. I need to find a way to tell the truth without completely destroying the image Carmen has of her childhood and her family. Mark was getting ready to leave when Mrs. Hope called him again. Mark, there's one more thing. I didn't just visit Helen's grave out of gratitude. All these years, I prayed that she would forgive me for the lie I've lived. And I also asked her to give me signs that I had done the right thing. And do you believe that finding these documents is a sign? I believe that Helen always knew that one day the truth would need to come out. Perhaps she planned this from the beginning. When Mark left Mrs. Hope's house, his mind was racing with all the information he had received. The story was much more complex than he had initially imagined, and he realized he was only scratching the surface of a mystery that involved generations. On his way back home, he passed by the municipal school where Caroline Morrison worked as a teacher. For a moment, he considered approaching the woman directly, but he decided to respect Mrs. Hope's request. At home, he organized all the documents he had found once again, this time with a much clearer understanding of their meaning. But there were still important gaps in the story that needed to be filled. The question of Caroline's biological mother remained a mystery. Mrs. Hope had been evasive on that point, which suggested she knew more than she was willing to admit. Mark decided he would need to investigate on his own, using the few clues available in the documents. On the baptism certificate, there was a signature besides the priest's, apparently a witness to the baptism. The handwriting was hard to decipher, but Mark managed to make out what looked like A. Montgomery. This name was unfamiliar to him, but it could be an important clue. He decided to return to the town hall archives the next day to investigate if there were any records of someone with the last name Montgomery from the 1940s. That night, he had trouble sleeping. Duke, sensitive to his owner's emotional state, remained lying beside the bed, occasionally resting his head on the mattress as a form of comfort. Mark reflected on the ethical implications of his discovery. On one hand, he felt he had a duty to reveal the truth, especially considering there might be a biological family that didn't know about the existence of descendants. On the other hand, he understood Mrs. Hope's dilemma and the potentially devastating impact the revelation could have on Caroline and Claire. The next morning, he returned to the town hall with a new strategy. Instead of looking directly for Montgomery records, he decided to investigate the most prominent families of Pinewood Hills in the 1940s. Mrs. Caroline received him again with kindness, curious about the progress of his historical research. "How was your investigation into Helen Oakwood, Mark? Did you find what you were looking for?" "I found some interesting things, Mrs. Caroline. Now I'm trying to get a better understanding of the important families in town back then. Do you know of any records of the most influential families from the 1940s? "Oh, yes. We have a specific archive about that. It was a very interesting time for our town. Many important families, mostly connected to coffee and commerce." She led Mark to a different section of the archive, where records about the town's social elite were kept. "Here are the records of the main families. Let's see. We had the Silverton family, the Oakley family, the Morrison family, who still have descendants here, the Montgomery family, the Anderson family." The name Montgomery made Mark interrupt Mrs. Caroline immediately. "Montgomery? Can you tell me more about that family?" The Montgomerys were one of the richest and most influential families in the region, owners of several coffee farms, and they also had businesses in the state capital. A very traditional family, very concerned with appearances and social status. Do they still live in town? The family still has properties here, but most of the descendants live in other, larger cities. Let me see if I can find more specific information. Mrs. Caroline flipped through some records until she found what she was looking for. Here it is. The family was headed by the patriarch Albert Montgomery and his wife Dorothy Montgomery. They had 3 children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. The daughter's name was Amelia Montgomery. The name Amelia echoed in Mark's mind. The signature on the baptism document could be A. Montgomery, Amelia Montgomery. This could be the clue he was looking for. Is there more information about Amelia Montgomery? Let's see. Amelia Montgomery, born in 1925. She would be, let me calculate, she would have been about 18 in 1943. Oh, here's an interesting note. Amelia Montgomery married a businessman from the state capital in 1950 and moved there permanently. And before the marriage, is there any information about what she did? There aren't many details, but it was common for elite young women to stay at home, preparing for marriage. Some helped with the church's social work. Mark felt he was on the right track, but he needed more information. The age matched perfectly. Amelia would have been 18 in 1943, old enough for an unplanned pregnancy that needed to be handled discreetly. Mrs. Caroline, by any chance, do you have the current address for the Montgomery family or information about the descendants? I do have some contacts, yes. Why are you specifically interested in them? Mark had to improvise quickly. I'm trying to map the connections between the old families of the town. Amelia Montgomery might have been a godmother or witness at baptisms for other families, and that would help me better understand the social relationships of the time. The explanation seemed to satisfy Mrs. Caroline, who wrote down an address and a phone number on a piece of paper. The main Montgomery property still exists, but it's practically abandoned. The person who handles the family's affairs around here is a manager. But if you want to speak with direct descendants, Amelia Montgomery is still alive. She lives in Denver and must be about 98 years old now. The information struck Mark like lightning. Amelia Montgomery, who could be Caroline's biological mother, was still alive. That meant Clarissa's real grandmother could still be in the world, unaware of the existence of her descendant. Do you have her contact information in Denver? Not directly, but I can get it through the property manager. He keeps in touch with the family when necessary for legal or property matters. Mark thanked her for the information and left the town hall with many more questions than answers. He was facing an even greater dilemma. If Amelia Montgomery really was Caroline's biological mother, should he contact her directly? Or should he first talk with Mrs. Hope about his discoveries? He decided the most ethical thing would be to return to Mrs. Hope and share his findings before taking any further action. After all, she had trusted him with secrets kept for 80 years, and he owed her at least the courtesy of keeping her informed about the developments. That afternoon, he returned to Mrs. Hope's house. This time she received him with less surprise, as if she already expected him to return with more information. "Mark, by the look on your face, I see you've discovered something important." "I have, Mrs. Hope, and I think you also knew more than you told me yesterday." She invited him inside again, and Mark noticed she seemed calmer than the day before, as if confessing the secrets had lifted a weight she had carried for decades. "Mrs. Hope, I found information about an Amelia Montgomery who would be the right age to be Carmen's biological mother. Do you know that name?" Mrs. Hope's reaction immediately confirmed Mark's suspicions. Her face paled, and she sat down slowly, as if her legs had lost their strength. "How did you find out about Amelia?" "So you knew it was her?" Mrs. Hope sighed deeply before answering. "Helen told me a few months before she passed. She said that if it was ever necessary, I should know that Amelia Montgomery was Carmen's biological mother." "Why didn't you tell me this yesterday?" "Because Amelia Montgomery is still alive, Mark, and because revealing this wouldn't just affect our family, but hers too. The Montgomerys have always been a very proud family, concerned with their reputation. Discovering that Amelia had a child out of wedlock in 1943 could be devastating for her, even after all these years." "But don't you think she has the right to know she has a daughter, a granddaughter, and a great-granddaughter?" "I don't know, Mark, I really don't. All these years I've wondered if I should look for her, but I always came to the conclusion that it would be selfish of me. Amelia made a choice in 1943. She gave the child up for adoption and built a new life. Who am I to undo that now?" Mark understood the dilemma, but he had a different perspective on the situation. "Mrs. Hope, with all due respect, but this isn't just your decision. Carmen also has the right to know her biological origins. And Claire, she has the right to know her biological great-grandmother, especially if Amelia Montgomery is still alive and in a condition to have a relationship with the family. What if Amelia doesn't want to know? What if she's devastated by this revelation? What if it destroys the peace she's managed to build over her lifetime? What if she's been waiting for this revelation for 80 years? What if she's always wondered what happened to the daughter she had to give up?" The debate continued for over an hour, with both presenting valid arguments about the ethical aspects of the situation. Finally, Mrs. Hope reached a decision. "Mark, I need time to think about all this, and before making any decision about Amelia Montgomery, I need to talk to Carmen. She has the right to know the truth about her adoption first." "When do you plan to do that?" "I don't know yet. Carmen is going through a difficult time at work, and Claire is preparing for her college entrance exams. Maybe it's better to wait until things calm down." Mark realized that Mrs. Hope was looking for excuses to postpone a conversation she knew was inevitable, but extremely difficult. "Mrs. Hope, can I suggest something? How about if you first talk to me about how to approach Carmen? We can rehearse different ways to present the information, to make it as least traumatic as possible." The suggestion seemed to ease some of Mrs. Hope's anxiety. "You would do that? You'd help me find the right words?" "Of course, and if you want, I can be present during the conversation to support both you and Carmen." They agreed to meet again on the weekend to plan the conversation with Carmen. Mark left the house with the feeling that he was finally helping to move the situation forward constructively. But on his way back home, he was surprised by an unexpected encounter. Claire was walking in the opposite direction, returning from the college in the neighboring town where she studied education. "Hi, Mark, how are you?" "Hi, Claire. All good, and you?" "I'm fine. Were you at my grandmother's house?" The question caught him off guard. Claire had seen him leaving Mrs. Hope's house, and lying at that moment could create complications later. "Yes, I was. Talking with her about some cemetery matters." "Cemetery matters? How strange." "Grandma came home yesterday very upset, said something had happened at the cemetery that made her sad." "Does it have to do with that?" Mark realized he was treading on dangerous ground. Claire was an intelligent and observant young woman, and any inconsistent information could spark her curiosity. "It's a delicate matter, Claire. A grave that your grandmother used to visit was exhumed by court order, and she was upset about it. I'm trying to help resolve the situation. Which grave did she visit? I thought she only visited my grandfather's grave. The question confirmed that Claire didn't know about her grandmother's monthly visits to Helen Oakwood Smith's grave. This could be an additional complication when the whole truth came out. It's complicated to explain, Claire. I think it's better if you talk directly to your grandmother about it. I tried talking to her, but she said it was nothing important, that I didn't need to worry. But I know my grandmother, Mark. She's suffering because of something, and that worries me. Mark felt a pang of guilt. His discovery was causing suffering not only for Mrs. Hope, but indirectly for Claire too, who noticed her grandmother's altered emotional state. Claire, can I give you some advice? Be patient with your grandmother. Sometimes older people carry burdens that are hard for them to share, but I believe she'll be able to talk to you about it soon. Do you think it has to do with her past? It might, yes. Claire became thoughtful for a few moments. Mark, can I tell you something strange? Since I was little, I've always felt there was some mystery in my family. I can't explain exactly what, but I've always had the feeling that my grandmother kept important secrets. What kind of feeling? Sometimes I'd catch her looking at old photos with a very sad expression, and when I asked about the family's past, she'd always quickly change the subject, as if there were things she didn't want to remember or couldn't talk about. Claire's sensitivity impressed Mark. Even without knowing the specific secrets, she had intuited that there were hidden aspects to her family's history. Claire, have you talked to your mother about these feelings? I've tried, but my mother always says that Grandma is just reserved by nature. My mother grew up thinking that's just how families are, that not everything needs to be talked about openly. And you don't agree? I don't know. I think secrets can be more harmful than the truth. Even if the truth is painful, at least it allows people to make conscious choices about their lives. The maturity of Claire's response surprised Mark. At 20 years old, she demonstrated an emotional wisdom that many people don't develop even at older ages. Claire, if you found out there are important secrets in your family, how would you like to be told? The question made Claire's eyes shine with curiosity. Why are you asking that, Mark? Do you know something? Mark realized he had gone too far and decided to backtrack. No, I don't know anything specific. It was just a hypothetical question based on our conversation about your grandmother. But Claire wasn't convinced. Mark, promise me one thing. If you find out anything important about my family, you'll tell me. I'd rather know the truth, even if it's hard to hear. Claire, please. I feel like something important is happening, and I don't like being in the dark. Promise? Mark found himself in an impossible situation. To promise would be to betray Mrs. Hope's trust. Not to promise would make Claire even more suspicious. Claire, can I promise you something different? I can promise that if there's something important for you to know, I'll help your grandmother find the best way to tell you. But I need to respect her right to be the first to decide what and when to share. The answer seemed to partially satisfy Claire. Okay. But do you promise me you'll insist that she doesn't leave me in the dark forever? I promise. They said goodbye, and Mark continued on his way home with even more worries on his mind. The conversation with Claire had shown that the situation was more delicate than he had imagined. The young woman already suspected there were family secrets, and her pressure for transparency could accelerate a revelation that Mrs. Hope wasn't yet prepared to make. At home, Mark spent the rest of the afternoon reflecting on all the complications his discovery had created. What had started as a routine exhumation had turned into a complex family drama involving multiple generations and decades of secrets. Duke, as always sensitive to his owner's mood, stayed close to him all afternoon. The dog seemed to understand that something important was happening, and his constant presence offered Mark a silent but significant comfort. That night, Mark made a decision. Regardless of what Mrs. Hope decided to do about Caroline, he felt it was necessary to try to contact Amelia Montgomery. After all, she was also a victim of the circumstances from 80 years ago and could be suffering from doubts and regrets, just as Mrs. Hope had suffered. He decided that the next day he would look for the manager of the Montgomery properties to try and get information on how to contact Amelia in Denver. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The next morning, Mark went to the address that Mrs. Caroline had given him. The Montgomery property was in the rural area of the town, in an area that had once been prosperous due to coffee cultivation, but now showed clear signs of neglect and decay. The main house was an imposing late 19th century building, with architectural features typical of the coffee plantations of the era. Even in a state of deterioration, one could tell it had been a luxurious residence, home to a family of great economic power and social influence. Mark found the manager, Mr. John Baptist, a man of about 60, who had been looking after the properties for more than 2 decades. He received Mark with some suspicion, as was natural when a stranger showed up asking questions about the Montgomery family. You said you're doing historical research on the old families of the town. For what purpose? Mark stuck to the story he had prepared. I'm interested in understanding the social connections between the important families of Pinewood Hills in the 1940s and 1950s. The Montgomery family appears frequently in the records I'm consulting, and I'd like more information about them to contextualize my research. Mr. John Baptist relaxed a little, but maintained his caution. The Montgomery family was indeed very important to the region. Mrs. Amelia, who is the only direct descendant still alive, keeps the properties mainly for sentimental reasons. She rarely comes here, but always insists that I keep everything in order. Do you keep in regular contact with Mrs. Amelia? Yes, we talk on the phone at least once a month. She likes to know how things are going here, even though she's lived in Denver for so many years. Would it be possible for you to give me her contact information? I'd like to speak directly with her about some historical matters. Mr. John Baptist visibly hesitated. Look, Mrs. Amelia is 98 years old, you know. She's still quite lucid, but she's very private. She doesn't like receiving calls from people she doesn't know. If you'd like, I can speak with her first, explain about your research, and if she agrees, I'll pass along the contact information. The proposal seemed reasonable to Mark, who didn't want to cause any kind of embarrassment for an elderly lady. That would be perfect, Mr. John Baptist. Could you explain to her that I'm specifically interested in the period from 1943 to 1946, when she still lived here in Pinewood Hills? I can, but may I ask why specifically that period? Mark had prepared an answer for that question. That period was very important for the town due to the social changes caused by the Second World War. Many families went through significant transformations, and I'm trying to document how those changes specifically affected the local families. The explanation seemed to satisfy Mr. John Baptist. That makes sense. I'll call Mrs. Amelia later today and explain about your research. If she agrees to speak with you, I'll be in touch. Thank you very much. Here's my number for anything. Mark left his contact information and returned to the city with the feeling that he had taken another important step in solving the mystery. Now all that was left was to wait and see if Amelia Montgomery would be willing to talk about a period of her life she probably preferred to forget. On the way back, he passed by the municipal school again and decided to observe Caroline from a distance. The 50-year-old woman was in the schoolyard, supervising the children's recess. Even from a distance, Mark could see the striking resemblance between her and the child in the photograph he had found on the grave. Caroline had a serene and affectionate expression as she interacted with the children. She was clearly a kind and dedicated person who had built a solid and respectable life in the community. The revelation about her adoption and her biological origins would certainly be a shock, but Mark hoped her emotional stability would help her process the information constructively. That afternoon, he received a call from Mr. John Baptist. Mr. Mark, I spoke with Mrs. Amelia about your research. She was a little surprised by the interest in the period from 1943 to 1946, but she agreed to speak with you. She said she has some memories from that time that might help your research. Mark's heart raced. He would finally have the chance to speak directly with the person who could be Caroline's biological mother. That's great. How can I get in touch with her? She preferred it to be by phone due to her age. Here is the number. Mark carefully wrote down the information, and they agreed he would call the next day in the afternoon, when Mrs. Amelia would be more inclined for a long conversation. That night, Mark spent hours mentally preparing for the conversation with Amelia Montgomery. He knew he would need to be extremely careful in his approach, starting with general historical questions before getting to the more delicate and personal points. The next day, exactly at 3 in the afternoon, he dialed the number Mr. John Baptist had given him. The phone rang several times before a woman's voice, somewhat fragile but still clear, answered. "Hello? Mrs. Amelia Montgomery? This is Mark Peterson, the researcher Mr. John Baptist mentioned." "Ah, yes, John told me about you. He said you're interested in the old history of Pinewood Hills." "Exactly, Mrs. Amelia. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak with me. I know you must have many interesting memories from that time." "I do, my son, although some are more pleasant to remember than others." The reply intrigued Mark. There was a melancholy in Mrs. Amelia's voice that suggested she carried her own sorrows from the past. "Mrs. Amelia, I'm specifically interested in the period between 1943 and 1946. Could you tell me what life was like in Pinewood Hills during those years?" "Ah, 1943. It was a very difficult year for me. I was only 18 and, well, that's when my life changed completely." Mark's heart raced. The way Mrs. Amelia referred to 1943 suggested something significant had happened that specific year. "Could you tell me more about that, if it's not too much trouble?" There was a long silence on the line, and Mark began to fear he had been too direct. "Mr. Mark, may I ask you a question? Why specifically 1943? Does that year have some special significance for your research?" Mark knew he had reached the crucial moment of the conversation. He needed to decide whether to stick with the historical research story or be honest about his true findings. He decided on honesty, but gradually. "Mrs. Amelia, I found some old documents that refer to events that took place in 1943 in Pinewood Hills. Documents that suggest there were delicate situations involving town families during that period." Another long silence. When Mrs. Amelia spoke again, her voice was noticeably emotional. "What kind of documents?" "Documents related to births and adoptions." The reaction was immediate. Mark heard a muffled sound that could have been a sob, followed by several minutes of total silence. "Mrs. Amelia, are you all right?" "Mr. Mark, did you find information about a child born in September 1943? "I did, yes." "A girl?" "Yes, a girl." Mrs. Amelia's crying was clearly audible over the phone. Mark waited patiently, allowing her to process her emotions before continuing the conversation. "Mr. Mark, for 80 years I have wondered what happened to my daughter. For 80 years I have carried the guilt of having had to give her up for adoption. Do you know what happened to her?" "Mrs. Amelia, your daughter was adopted by a very good family from Pinewood Hills. She was raised with much love and affection, and today she is a respected woman in the community." Is she still alive?" "Yes, she is. And you have a beautiful granddaughter and a great-granddaughter." Mrs. Amelia's crying intensified, but now Mark could tell they were tears of relief and joy, not just sadness. "What is her name?" "Caroline. Caroline Morrison." "Caroline. What a beautiful name. And does she know about me?" "Not yet. The family that adopted her kept her origins a secret all these years, but I believe she will soon know the truth." "Mr. Mark, can I tell you something? All these years, not a single day has gone by that I haven't thought of her. Not a week has passed without me wondering if she was well, if she was happy, if she needed anything. Why did you have to give her up for adoption, Mrs. Amelia? It was 1943, Mr. Mark. I was an unmarried 18-year-old girl from a very conservative family that was concerned with appearances. When they found out I was pregnant, it was a terrible scandal. My father wanted to send me away so no one in town would know." "And the child's father?" "He was a young man from town, a few years older than me. He was married, Mr. Mark. When he found out about the pregnancy, he denied any responsibility and threatened to sue us for defamation if we continued to accuse him." The story was becoming sadder and more complex than Mark had imagined. How did the midwife Helen Oakwood Smith get involved in the situation? Helen was a wise and compassionate woman. She found out about my situation through the town's network of women. You know how these things spread. Helen came to me and said she knew a young family who couldn't have children and who would give a lot of love to my baby. And you agreed. I had no choice, Mr. Mark. My family made it clear that either I gave the child up for adoption or I would be thrown out of the house and lose any financial or social support. Back then, a woman alone with a child born out of wedlock had no prospects for a decent life. Mark felt a deep compassion for the young woman that Mrs. Amelia had been 80 years ago, forced to make an impossible decision in a society that offered no alternatives for women in her situation. Mrs. Amelia, did you ever get to see the child after birth? I did. Yes. Helen allowed me to stay with her for 3 days after the delivery. They were the 3 happiest and saddest days of my life. I breastfed her, sang to her, did all the things a mother does with her baby. And then I had to give her up. What was that moment like? It was terrible, Mr. Mark. I felt as if they were tearing a piece of my soul away. But Helen assured me that the family who would receive my daughter was very good, that they would love her as if she were their own. And then? Did you never try to get any news? Helen told me it would be better for everyone if I didn't seek information. She said it would make it harder both for me and for the child and the adoptive family. But she promised me that if it ever became important, she would find a way to tell me about my daughter. Helen kept that promise, Mrs. Amelia, in a very special way. How so? Mark explained how the documents had been found in Helen's grave and how that had led to the discovery of the whole story. Helen was truly a very wise woman, Mr. Mark. She knew that one day the truth would need to come out, but she also knew that we needed to wait for the right time. Mrs. Amelia, would you like to meet your daughter? The question was followed by a long, emotional silence. More than anything in the world, Mr. Mark. But I'm afraid too. What if she doesn't want to meet me? What if she's angry with me for giving her up? What if she's happy without knowing about me and my presence only brings complications to her life? Mrs. Amelia, can I assure you of one thing? Caroline is a good and understanding woman. She works as a teacher, helping children every day. I'm sure she will understand the circumstances that forced you to make that decision. And my granddaughter, what is she like? Claire is a beautiful, intelligent, and full of life young woman. She is studying education and has a very generous heart. You would be very proud of her. Claire, what a beautiful name. Mr. Mark, what should I do now? How can I meet them without causing problems? Leave it to me, Mrs. Amelia. I will talk to the adoptive family and arrange a meeting in the best way possible. But can I ask you something? Can you give me some time to organize everything properly? Of course, my boy. I've waited 80 years. I can wait a little longer if it means the meeting will be better for everyone. Thank you, Mrs. Amelia. I promise to contact you very soon. Mr. Mark, before you hang up, can I thank you? You have no idea of the gift you have just given me. Knowing that my daughter is well, that she is happy and respected, that I have a granddaughter and a great-granddaughter, it's more than I dreamed of all these years. You're welcome, Mrs. Amelia. It was a privilege to be able to reunite this family. After hanging up the phone, Mark remained seated in silence for several minutes, processing everything he had discovered. Amelia Montgomery's story was even more touching than he had imagined. A young woman forced to give up her daughter due to the rigid social conventions of her time, who had carried that pain for 8 decades. Now came the most delicate part, convincing Mrs. Hope to reveal the truth to Caroline, and preparing all the women involved for a meeting that would be emotionally intense for everyone. That night, Mark called Mrs. Hope. Mrs. Hope, I need to speak with you urgently. I've discovered very important information about Amelia Montgomery. What did you find out? She is alive, lives in Denver, and for 80 years she has wondered what happened to the daughter she had to give up for adoption. Mrs. Hope, she really wants to meet Caroline. The silence on the line lasted almost a full minute. My God, Mark, what are we going to do? We're going to do what should have been done a long time ago. We're going to reunite this family. But how? How am I going to tell this to Caroline? How do I explain that I lied to her for 50 years? We'll do it together, Mrs. Hope. Tomorrow I will come to your house and we will plan exactly how to tell Caroline everything. And then, if she agrees, we will arrange a meeting with Amelia. What if Caroline gets angry with me? What if she can't forgive me for having lied for so long? Mrs. Hope, Caroline is your daughter in every way that truly matters. You raised her with love, took care of her when she was sick, taught her values, were present for all the important moments in her life. The fact that you didn't give birth to her doesn't diminish the love between you two at all. Do you really believe that? I am absolutely certain. And you know why? Because love has nothing to do with blood. It has to do with presence, care, dedication, and you gave all of that to Caroline for 50 years. The conversation continued for another hour, with Mark trying to reassure Mrs. Hope and prepare her for the conversation they would have to have with Caroline. They agreed to meet the next day to plan all the details. The next morning, Mark arrived at Mrs. Hope's house and found her visibly nervous. She had been up all night, thinking about all the possible reactions Caroline could have upon discovering the truth about her origins. "Mark, I couldn't sleep. I keep imagining how I will find the words to explain 50 years of a lie." "Mrs. Hope, it wasn't 50 years of a lie. It was 50 years of protective love. You did what you thought was best at the time, with the information and circumstances you had." They spent the entire morning rehearsing different ways to approach Caroline. Mark suggested they start by telling her about the discovery of the documents at the cemetery, then explain about the adoption, and only then reveal the identity of the birth mother. "It's important that you emphasize you weren't hiding this out of shame or lack of love. It was to protect Caroline and to preserve the family's harmony. And what if she asks why I'm revealing it now? You can say that the documents that appeared forced a situation where not revealing would be worse than revealing, and that Caroline has the right to decide if she wants to meet her birth mother or not." Mrs. Hope agreed with the strategy and decided she would call Caroline that same day, asking her to come over for dinner at her house. During the meal, in a familiar and welcoming environment, they would reveal the whole truth. In the afternoon, Mrs. Hope made the call. "Caroline? It's Mom. Could you come over for dinner tonight? I need to talk to you about something important." "Of course, Mom. Is everything all right?" Your voice sounds strange. "Everything's fine, dear. It's just a conversation I need to have with you. Can you come around 7? "Yes, I can. I'll check with Claire to see if she wants to come too." "Actually, Caroline, I'd prefer it to be just the two of us today. We can talk to Claire later." The answer left Caroline clearly intrigued, but she agreed to come alone. At 7 o'clock sharp, Caroline arrived at her mother's house. Mark had left a few minutes earlier, but remained in the garden, ready to come in if Mrs. Hope needed support. Through the window, he could see the two women sitting at the dining room table. Mrs. Hope seemed nervous, constantly fidgeting with her hands, while Caroline watched her mother with growing concern. "Mom, what's going on? You're worrying me." Mrs. Hope took a deep breath and began the conversation as they had planned. "Caroline, last week something happened at the cemetery that brought to light information about our family's past. Information that I've kept secret for many years, but that I now need to share with you." "What kind of information?" "Mark, the gravedigger, found some old documents during an exhumation. Documents that talk about you when you were a baby." Caroline leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "About me when I was a baby? What kind of documents?" "Caroline, my dear daughter, what I'm about to tell you might be shocking, but I want you to know that nothing I reveal changes the love I feel for you or the pride I have in the wonderful woman you've become." "Mom, you're scaring me. What is this about?" Mrs. Hope took Caroline's hands in hers and looked directly into her eyes. "Caroline, you're adopted." The silence that followed was deafening. Caroline remained completely still for several seconds, processing the information she had just received. When she finally reacted, her voice was low and controlled. "Adopted? What do you mean, adopted?" "Your father and I couldn't have children. When you were a baby, the town midwife came to us saying she knew a young woman who had gotten pregnant and couldn't keep the child. You came to our home when you were just 3 months old." Caroline withdrew her hands from her mother's and leaned back in her chair, still processing the revelation. "Did my father know?" "No, I faked a pregnancy for him." When you arrived, he believed you were our biological daughter. You lied to him his entire life? It wasn't a lie. I protected our family. Back then, adoption was viewed very differently. There could have been prejudice, social difficulties. Caroline stood up and began pacing the room, clearly agitated. Mum, you lied to me for 50 years. 50 years. How can you call that protection? Caroline, please, try to understand. Understand what? That my whole life has been based on a lie. That I don't know who I really am, where I come from, what my true story is. Tears began to stream down Caroline's face, and Mrs. Hope stood up to try to comfort her. My daughter, you know exactly who you are. You are my daughter. You're a teacher, you're Claire's mother. None of that changes. It does change, Mom. It changes everything. I have a biological mother somewhere in the world. Maybe I have siblings, grandparents, an entire family history that I know nothing about. It was at that moment that Mark decided to enter the house. Caroline saw him and immediately understood that he had known everything from the start. You knew, didn't you, Mark? You knew, and you didn't tell me. Caroline, I only found out a few days ago, and I thought your adoptive mother had the right to tell you first. My adoptive mother. I'm still trying to process that. Caroline sat down again, this time with an air of total exhaustion. Where are these documents you found? Mark carefully took the papers out of his folder and placed them on the table. Caroline examined each document carefully, reading every word as if trying to decipher the mysteries of her own existence. Mary Helen. That was my original name? Yes, it was. And here it says my biological mother wasn't identified. How did you find out who she was? Mark looked at Mrs. Hope, who nodded. We did some research in the town archives. We found out your biological mother's name is Amelia Montgomery. Montgomery. The Montgomery family from here in town. Yes. Amelia Montgomery was 18 when you were born. She was forced by her family to give you up for adoption due to the social conventions of the time. Caroline was silent for several minutes, absorbing all the information. Is she still alive? She is. She lives in Denver and is 98 years old. And does she know about me? She found out 2 days ago. She was very emotional to discover that you are well and that you have a daughter and a granddaughter. Does she want to meet me? Very much. But she said only if you want to meet her. Caroline looked at her adoptive mother, who remained silent, respecting her daughter's process of assimilation. Mom, why now? Why decide to tell this after so long? Mrs. Hope approached Caroline again. Because when the documents appeared, I realized I couldn't keep this secret any longer, and because you deserve to have the choice of whether or not to meet your biological mother, I can no longer make that decision for you. Are you afraid that I will love you less after meeting my biological mother? The question hit Mrs. Hope squarely. She began to cry as she answered. Yes, I am. I am afraid of losing you. I am afraid that you will discover she is a better person than I am, that she could have given you things I couldn't give you. Caroline stood up and hugged her adoptive mother tightly. Mom, you gave me the most important thing there is. Unconditional love. You were with me when I was sick. You comforted me when I cried. You celebrated my victories. You supported me in all the important decisions of my life. That never changes. The hug between the two women lasted several minutes, and Mark felt he had witnessed a very special moment of reconciliation and reaffirmation of family love. When they separated, Caroline had a more serene expression. Mark, can you tell me more about Amelia Montgomery? What is she like? What did she do with her life? She married a few years after giving you up for adoption and moved to Denver. She had a respectable life, but never had other children. For 80 years, she wondered what had happened to the daughter she had to give up. Was she forced to give me up? She was. Her family threatened her with disinheritance and social exclusion if she kept you. At that time, it was practically impossible for a single woman to raise a child alone. And my biological father? He was a married man who denied paternity and threatened to sue her family for defamation. Caroline shook her head sadly. A typical story for the time, unfortunately. Caroline, what would you like to do now? Would you like to speak with Amelia on the phone first? I think so. Before deciding if I want to meet her in person, I would like to talk to her. And what about Claire? When do you plan to tell her? Caroline looked at her adoptive mother. What do you think, Mom? I think Claire has the right to know. She has always been very mature and understanding, and maybe it will be easier for her to accept than it was for you, since she hasn't carried the false story for so long. Shall we tell her tomorrow? Let's. Mark offered to arrange the call between Caroline and Amelia, and they gratefully accepted. They agreed the conversation would happen over the weekend, so Caroline would have time to prepare emotionally. When Mark left the house that night, he felt they had taken a giant step in resolving the family drama. Caroline's initial reaction had been better than they expected, and the emotional bond between her and her adoptive mother had been strengthened by the revelation. On Saturday morning, Caroline called Claire asking her to come for lunch at her grandmother's house. Grandma and I need to talk to you about an important discovery about our family. A discovery? What kind of discovery? It's better if we talk in person, dear. Can you come around noon? Claire arrived promptly, clearly intrigued by the mystery surrounding this family lunch. Caroline and Mrs. Hope had decided it would be best to tell her everything at once, without beating around the bush. Claire, sit here. Your mother and I have something very important to tell you. The young woman sat down expectantly, her eyes shining with curiosity. Are you finally going to tell me what was making Grandma so sad last week? Caroline smiled affectionately at her daughter. Among other things, yes. Claire, do you remember me telling you that I always felt there was something mysterious about our family? Yes, I remember. And were you right? I was. We discovered that I'm adopted. Claire's reaction was completely different from her mother's. Instead of shock or sadness, her eyes shone even brighter. Really? That's amazing. Does that mean we have a whole biological family we don't know? Claire's positive reaction surprised both Caroline and Mrs. Hope. You're not upset? Why would I be upset? This is like discovering we have a secret family. It's exciting. Caroline laughed for the first time since the revelation. Your reaction is very different from mine. Mom, you were raised believing you were Grandma's biological daughter. For you, discovering the adoption must have been like discovering that part of your identity was different from what you thought. For me, this is just additional information about our family. The maturity of the answer impressed the two older women. And there's more, Claire. Your biological grandmother is still alive and wants to meet you. Really? How old is she? 98 years old. Wow, she must have amazing stories to tell. When can we meet her? Mrs. Hope watched the interaction between mother and daughter with a mixture of relief and admiration. Claire's reaction was helping Caroline see the situation from a more positive perspective. Claire, your mother is going to talk to her on the phone first this weekend. Depending on how it goes, we might arrange a meeting. Can I join the call? Caroline looked at Mrs. Hope, who nodded. Yes, you can. I think it will be good for you to get to know each other gradually. That afternoon, Mark arranged the phone call between the three generations of women. Caroline was visibly nervous, but Claire radiated enthusiasm, which helped keep the atmosphere lighter. When the phone rang in Denver, it was Amelia who answered immediately, as if she had been waiting for the call for hours. Hello? Mrs. Amelia? This is Caroline, your daughter. The silence on the line lasted almost a minute. When Amelia spoke again, her voice was full of emotion. Caroline, my girl, after 80 years, I can finally talk to you. Hi, Mother. The word mother caused a deep emotional impact on both of them. Caroline began to cry, and on the other end of the line, Amelia also couldn't hold back her tears. My daughter, tell me about your life. Were you happy? Did you have a good childhood? I was very happy. I was raised with lots of love. I had opportunities to study. I became a teacher. I have a wonderful daughter. You're a teacher? How wonderful. I always dreamed that you could have an education and opportunities that I never had. And you, what was your life like? It was good, my daughter. I got married, lived in Denver, had a comfortable life. But I always always thought of you. Not a day went by that I didn't wonder how you were. Mrs. Amelia. It was Claire who spoke. Who is this sweet voice? I'm Claire, your great-granddaughter. Claire, my great-granddaughter. What a blessing it is to hear your voice. Tell me about yourself, my dear. I'm 20 years old. I'm studying education. I want to be a teacher like my mother, and I'm very curious to meet you. And I'm looking forward to meeting you. Claire, your mother told me you look a lot like I did when I was young. Really? Do we have old pictures of you? Yes, I do. Lots of pictures. When you come visit me, I'll show you our whole family history. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with the three women sharing stories, memories, and plans for the future. Mrs. Hope stayed in the background, respecting that moment of family reconnection, but she was clearly moved to see how everything was unfolding so positively. By the end of the conversation, they had agreed that Caroline and Claire would travel to Denver the following weekend to meet Amelia in person. "Mum, aren't you coming with us?" Caroline asked Mrs. Hope. "Do you think it would be appropriate?" "Of course. You're as much my mother as Mrs. Amelia is, and I'm sure she would like to meet you and thank you for taking such good care of me." When they hung up the phone, the three women hugged in a group embrace that symbolized the new family configuration that was emerging. Throughout that week, Caroline and Claire prepared for the trip to Denver. Caroline researched the Montgomery family, discovering fascinating stories about their ancestors. Claire, with her typical enthusiasm, had already made a list of questions she wanted to ask her great-grandmother. Mark observed all these preparations from a distance, pleased to see that his discovery had resulted in a positive family reunion instead of trauma and division. On the Friday before the trip, Caroline came to see him at the cemetery. "Mark, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for our family." "I didn't do anything special, Caroline. I just found some papers." "No, you did much more than that. You could have just handed the documents over to the authorities and forgotten about it. Instead, you cared enough to investigate, to understand the story, to look after our feelings throughout the whole process. I just did what I thought was right, and that's exactly what made all the difference. Mark, I'd like to extend an invitation to you. I'd like you to come with us to Denver. After all, you're the person who made this reunion possible." The offer deeply moved Mark. "Are you sure? Wouldn't I be intruding? It would be an honor to have you there. Mrs. Amelia also wants to meet you in person." Mark accepted the invitation, and on Saturday morning the four of them set off for Denver: Caroline, Claire, Mrs. Hope, and Mark. Throughout the trip, there was an atmosphere of positive expectation, but also a natural nervousness given such a significant meeting. Amelia Montgomery lived in an elegant apartment in the Cherry Creek neighborhood with a view of the mountains surrounding Denver. When they arrived at the building, Claire was visibly eager to go up. "Do you think she'll like us?" "Claire, she's waited 80 years for this moment. I'm sure she'll love meeting you," Mark replied. When they rang the apartment doorbell, the door opened almost immediately. Amelia Montgomery was there, a petite but elegant lady with bright eyes and a radiant smile. What happened next was one of the most emotional moments any of them had ever experienced. Amelia looked at Caroline and immediately recognized the features she had kept in her memory for 80 years. "Caroline, my daughter." Caroline slowly approached, also recognizing physical similarities that definitively confirmed her genetic connection to this woman. "Mother." Finally. They hugged for long minutes, both crying with joy and relief. It was the hug that had been interrupted 80 years earlier, finally happening. Then Amelia turned to Claire. "And you must be my beautiful great-granddaughter." "Yes, I am," said Claire, embracing her great-grandmother with all the enthusiasm of her 20 years. "You're even more beautiful than I imagined. And you really do look a lot like me when I was your age." Mrs. Hope remained a little apart, watching the reunion with emotion but also with some uncertainty about her role at that moment. It was then that Amelia approached her. "And you must be Hope, the woman who raised my daughter with so much love." "Yes, I am. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Amelia. The pleasure is all mine, and I want you to know that I will be eternally grateful to you for giving Caroline everything that I couldn't. You don't have to thank me. Caroline brought happiness to my life for 50 years. Then we are two very happy and blessed mothers. The meeting lasted the entire day. Amelia had prepared a special lunch and organized photo albums that told the story of the Montgomery family over the decades. Caroline and Claire discovered they had relatives scattered across various cities in the country, a rich family history that included farmers, merchants, and even some artists. This here is my mother, your biological grandmother Caroline. She was an amateur pianist and painted beautiful watercolors. Where do you think I got my taste for drawing? Commented Claire. It must be a genetic inheritance indeed. Several women in our family were artistic. In the afternoon, Amelia told stories about her youth in Pinewood Hills, including details about the period of her pregnancy and Caroline's birth. I had chosen the name Mary Helen for you, in honor of the midwife who was helping us. But when I found out that your adoptive parents had chosen Caroline, I thought it was perfect. It's a beautiful name. Now I understand why I always felt connected to the name Mary. Sometimes I would sign my schoolwork as Mary Caroline, without knowing why. It's incredible how certain things stay in the subconscious, even when we have no conscious memory of them. Late in the afternoon, Amelia made a proposal that surprised everyone. Caroline, Claire, I would like to make you an offer. I have some properties and investments that I intend to leave as an inheritance. Since you are my only direct family, I would like you to accept being my heirs. Caroline was visibly uncomfortable with the proposal. Mrs. Amelia, we didn't come here looking for an inheritance, we came looking for family. And you found it. But a family takes care of each other, right? I have resources that can help you have more opportunities to fulfill dreams. That would make me very happy. Can we talk about this later? First, I want us to develop our relationship to get to know each other better. Of course, my daughter, we have all the time in the world now. When it was time to say goodbye, everyone was emotionally exhausted but deeply satisfied. They had agreed that Caroline and Claire would return to visit Amelia monthly, and that she would try to make at least one trip to Pinewood Hills to see the town where her daughter was born. During the journey back, the group was in contemplative silence. Each was processing in their own way everything that had happened on that extraordinary day. It was Claire who broke the silence. Did you notice how everything fit together perfectly? The documents appearing exactly at the right time, Mark finding the right clues, all of us being open to dealing with the revelations. It's true, agreed Caroline. It's as if Helen Oakwood Smith had orchestrated everything from beyond to happen at the appropriate moment. Mark smiled. Or perhaps she just planted the right seeds, knowing that when the time came, people of goodwill would make things happen. Either way, said Mrs. Hope, I'm happy that everything worked out this way. I never imagined that revealing an 80-year-old secret could result in so much joy instead of sadness. In the weeks that followed, life in Pinewood Hills returned to a new normal. Caroline and Claire developed a routine of regular phone conversations with Amelia, and with each call, they discovered more details about their family history. The news about the family reunion spread through the town, as was inevitable in a small community. But most people's reaction was positive, with many residents expressing admiration for the mature and loving way the situation had been handled by everyone involved. 1 month after the meeting, Caroline sought out Mark again. Mark, Mrs. Amelia insists on giving you a reward for reuniting our family. She said you are an angel in disguise. I don't need a reward, Caroline. Seeing you happy is reward enough. She knew you would say that. So, instead of offering money, she wants to make you a different proposal. What proposal? She wants to fund your studies if you're interested in going to college. She said a person with your sensitivity and intelligence should have more opportunities in life. The offer completely surprised Mark. But I'm already 35 years old. So what? It's never too late to study and grow. What do you think? Have you always wanted to take a college course? Mark admitted that he had always dreamed of studying history, but had never had the financial means to do so. History would be perfect. You could even specialize in family history and genealogy. Imagine how many other families could benefit from someone with your investigative skills. The idea began to make sense to Mark. Perhaps his discovery in the cemetery had been not only the beginning of a family reunion, but also the start of a new career for him. 2 months later, Mark was enrolled in the history course at the Regional Federal University, with all expenses paid by Amelia Montgomery. Caroline had offered to help him with his studies, and Claire had suggested that he write his final thesis on the history of the Montgomery family and the social impact of adoptions in the first half of the 20th century. Duke adapted well to his owner's new study routine, often sleeping at the foot of the desk while Mark read his textbooks. 6 months after the initial discovery, Amelia Montgomery made her first trip to Pinewood Hills in over 70 years. The town had changed a lot, but she still recognized important landmarks from her youth. During the visit, she made a point of going to the cemetery to visit the grave where Helen Oakwood Smith had hidden the documents that made the family reunion possible. "Helen really was a wise woman," she commented, placing flowers on the grave. "She knew that secrets have their right time to be revealed." "You don't have any regrets about anything?" asked Caroline. "About getting pregnant at 18? "No. You were the result of that, and you are perfect. About being forced to give you up? Yes, I do. I wish we had had other options back then, but I can't change the past. I can only enjoy the present we've been given." "And about the future? What would you like to happen?" "I would like to see Claire graduate, maybe meet a great-grandchild or great-granddaughter. I would like to be able to tell you all the family stories I haven't told yet. And I would like to be able to make a positive difference in your lives, making up a little for the lost time." During that visit, Amelia made an important decision. She decided to sell her properties in Denver and move to a house in Pinewood Hills so she could live daily with her rediscovered family. "At 98 years old, I don't have many years left. I want to spend the time I have left surrounded by the people I love." The decision was met with enthusiasm by Caroline and Claire, who helped Amelia find a comfortable house near the downtown area. 1 year after the initial discovery, the family organized a special party to celebrate the first anniversary of the reunion. The party was held at Mrs. Hope's house with the attendance of the entire extended family and some close friends, including Mark. During the party, Amelia gave an emotional speech. "1 year ago, I was a 97-year-old woman, living with the pain of not knowing what had happened to the daughter I had to give up. Today, I am a 98-year-old woman surrounded by a loving family and dear new friends." She looked specifically at Mark. "Mark, you have no idea of the gift you gave us when you decided to investigate those documents instead of simply following the bureaucracy. Your curiosity and compassion changed all of our lives." "The gift was mutual, Mrs. Amelia. Meeting you and seeing this family reunite has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life." "And it's not over yet," Claire interjected. "Mark is writing a book about our family's story. It will help other people who are searching for their origins." "Really?" asked Amelia, interested. "It's a project for my history course. I'm documenting not only our specific story, but also how adoption practices have changed over the decades and how that has affected American families." "How wonderful! Our story will help other people find their families too." The party continued late into the night, with many stories, laughter, and plans for the future. When it finally ended, everyone left with the feeling that they weren't just celebrating an anniversary, but celebrating the power of truth, love, and perseverance. 2 years later, Mark graduated in history with honors, specializing in genealogy and family history. His work on the Montgomery family became an academic reference on adoptions in 20th century America. He set up a small genealogical research office in Pinewood Hills and began helping other people discover their family origins. Duke became his official mascot, always present during interviews and research. Caroline became the principal of the municipal school and implemented an oral history program where students interviewed elderly town residents to preserve local memories. Claire graduated in education and began working as her mother's assistant at the school. She also started a serious relationship with a young man from a neighboring town. Mrs. Hope, now in her 70s, became the town's unofficial chronicler, documenting family stories and helping Mark with his genealogical research. Amelia Montgomery, despite her advanced age, remained active and lucid. She became a sort of respected matriarch of the community, always willing to share stories from the past and life advice. On her 100th birthday, Amelia organized a big party in the central square of Pinewood Hills. During the speeches, she shared a reflection that deeply touched everyone present. "When I was young, I thought my life had been ruined by a moment of recklessness. For decades I carried guilt and regret. But now, at 100 years old, I see that everything was part of a greater plan that I couldn't comprehend at the time." She looked at each member of her reunited family. "If I hadn't gotten pregnant in 1943, Caroline wouldn't exist. If Caroline didn't exist, Claire wouldn't exist. And if Claire didn't exist, she wouldn't be here today to announce that she is expecting my first great-great-grandchild." The announcement of Claire's pregnancy was a surprise to everyone, except for Amelia, who had been the first to know. Life has a mysterious way of showing us that there are no mistakes, just different paths that lead to the same destinations of love and happiness. Mark, now 40 years old, married to one of the new school teachers and father of 2 young children, watched that celebration with deep satisfaction. His chance discovery in the cemetery had turned into a chain of events that had positively changed the lives of many people. Duke, now an old but still loyal dog, rested quietly at Mark's feet, occasionally lifting his head as if he also appreciated the celebration. During the speeches at the centennial anniversary party, the town mayor announced that the municipal cemetery would be renamed the Helen Oakwood Smith Memorial Cemetery, in honor of the midwife who had not only made possible the birth of many children in the region, but also the reunion of a family after 80 years of separation. The cemetery's dedication plaque contained a phrase that Amelia had suggested: "Helen Oakwood Smith, midwife of bodies and reunifier of souls." On the night of the party, after everyone had left, Amelia asked Caroline and Mark to accompany her on one last visit to Helen's grave. "I want to thank her one last time," said Amelia, placing flowers on the grave. "One last time?" asked Caroline, worried. "Don't worry, my dear. I'm not planning on leaving anytime soon. But at 100 years old, we know that each day is a gift, and I like to keep my gratitude up to date." The 3 remained silent for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about how a simple decision by Helen to preserve some documents had changed so many lives decades later. "Helen was truly a woman ahead of her time," commented Mark. "She understood that sometimes we need to plant seeds that will only sprout long after." "And what beautiful seeds she planted," added Caroline. An entire family reunited, a young man who discovered his calling, a community that learned about forgiveness and acceptance. "And most importantly," concluded Amelia, "she taught us that the truth always finds its way, even if it takes 80 years to appear." When they left the cemetery that night, walking slowly due to Amelia's age but with steady and satisfied steps, the 3 knew they had been part of something much bigger than themselves. They had been instruments in a story of redemption, forgiveness, and love that transcended generations. End of story. So, what did you think of this touching story of family reunion? How do you think you would react if you discovered family secrets kept for decades? Leave your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other touching stories like this one.